Feel like a footballer, like taking a quick swig before you get subbed on into the match. You're going to be ready to go. Good morning, friends. Good morning, brothers and sisters of the Stratford Church of Christ. It is wonderful to be here this morning and to be with you all. We're so thankful for everyone who is here and for all of our friends and visitors even who might be on the Zoom this morning. We welcome you. We're glad that you have made the effort to join us from wherever you are. Our church's theme for 2026, we're entering the third month, so I feel like there's probably going to be a pop quiz at some point soon to see if we're learning what the theme and counting that to our memories yet. But the theme for the year derives from Ephesians chapter 4, found in verse 12 there. If you have your Bibles or your app on your phone, can I encourage you to please turn to Ephesians chapter 4. Our theme for the year, equipped to serve. Equipped to serve. You can find that phrase or words from that phrase at least found in verse 12 of chapter 4. It's my understanding that I was in the men's Bible class this morning. We did talk about this theme and we talked about Ephesians chapter 4, and it's my understanding that the women also talked about chapter 4, which means that we're all warmed up for a sermon that's focused on chapter 4. And we're going to need the warming up of our engines and of our minds this morning, because we're going to focus on the bridge from old to new. And Paul talks about a bridge, about moving from old to new, and this bridge is all about our minds. Within our youth study, in Bible class, we've been focused on Ephesians as well. We have been thinking about Ephesians in two sections. The first section is defining and understanding what the gospel is. That's the first half of Ephesians. The second half of Ephesians is focused on putting that gospel message into practice. How does the gospel message change the way that we live our lives once we have accepted that gospel message? And certainly verse 12 of chapter 4 falls right in line with putting the gospel message into action and living it out, being equipped to serve. But first, to set some context this morning, as a youth, like many youth in this room and maybe many adults in this room, as a youth, I spent a lot of time involved in sport, playing sports, but also watching sports. One of the ways that my dad and I bonded growing up was my dad would take me to a lot of sporting events. We would go watch the older teenagers, especially as a young kid. He would take me to watch the high school, the secondary kids playing their sports. But we weren't just sitting there. My dad was challenging me and quizzing me the whole time that we were watching these sporting events. Because he would challenge me by saying, "Daniel, see this player on the pitch here, or this player on the court there? If the ball comes to them next, and you were in their position, what would you do? How would you react? How would you respond?" And of course, after a while, you're like, "Dad, come on now, can we just sit back and enjoy this game? You're sitting here quizzing me, and it's like I'm taking a test, and we're supposed to be having some fun watching a sporting event." But my dad did this for years and years. Every time we would go to a sporting event, just quizzing me, making me think about and consider putting myself in these different scenarios. And it turns out, my dad was onto something. I know it's hard for us as we get older to admit that our parents were right about things, but in many ways, my dad was really right about the way in which he was preparing me mentally to then go and play the sport physically. The medical professionals in the room here, we have several doctors and nurses and many folk who are involved in various medical roles. You can correct me on this if I'm inaccurate, because I am not a medical professional. But what studies are showing is that the mind is more powerful than anyone could have ever imagined. The mind has the ability to impact our behaviors and physical outcomes in ways that we never could have comprehended. Just a few examples. We've all, I think, been familiar with the term the placebo effect. Oftentimes in medical studies and trials, there are multiple cohorts of individuals that are tested in various ways to see whether drugs are reacting in safe ways that can then be applied to the entire population. And so one of the things that medical researchers do is they'll have a control group that is given a placebo and a second group that's given the actual drug. And some of these studies, for certain drugs, I know this is not the case across the board, but some of these studies are showing that just simply the mental effect of thinking that you were taking the actual drug has medical and physical benefit. Okay, so placebos. Another example of this has to do with the perception of time and the body's ability to heal wounds. This one was fascinating to me. People who had wounds in other studies were told that they would essentially be put like in a room, and they wouldn't be told how much time has passed. And they would sleep and then come out of this room. And they would then tell them a false time that they had told them they were in the room longer than they had thought. And what this did to their minds is that it triggered their body to think that they had spent more time healing and recovering than they had, which in return was showing that healing was actually happening faster, just sheerly because they thought that there had been a longer amount of time to recover from their injury. The third one here, mental stress has an impact on the body's immune and defense system. If your body is mentally stressed, and I know many of us probably experience this, the stress put on our minds suppresses our body's ability to fight against sickness and illness. It suppresses our immune system so much to the extent that we can get sick or that we can more easily get injured because just mentally we're stressed. And then finally, the fourth one, to tie this back to my own anecdote from my early childhood. Did you know today that professional athletes, these professional clubs and teams, are hiring medical professionals to put these professional athletes that are paid millions and millions and millions of dollars and pounds and euros into dark rooms where they then just talk to them about the scenarios that they're going to be in games. And they're telling them to visualize scoring that game-winning goal. Visualize hitting that game-winning jump shot. There is millions of dollars and pounds being poured into just simply helping these athletes visualize success, because the mind has power and influence over our behaviors and the physical ways that our body behaves. Ephesians chapter 4, and I have to give credit here to Dr. Tim Mackey. I don't know him, but I have benefited a lot from his Bible studies, his sermons, his notes, and his series on Ephesians. I've taken a lot of inspiration from even in this lesson. So I want to credit and to cite my resources and make sure I'm not stealing these awesome insights from him. But one of the things that I've, in studying Ephesians and benefiting from Tim Mackey's sermons and lessons, he has called out one of Paul's greatest emphases in the book of Ephesians, in the letter to the Ephesians, as being that our behaviors are directly tied to our identity, or who we think that we are. Our behaviors are directly tied to our identities, or what we think makes us who we are. Understanding the gospel is not just about changing behaviors. It's about changing your mindset, which then in turn leads to transformation in behavior. So, in our lesson today, we're going to look at just a few verses in Ephesians chapter 4. We already read them, and I'll put them back up on the screen here. We're going to extend back just a little bit earlier in the passage to verse 17. So if you have your Bible, look there at Ephesians chapter 4, verse 17. So this I say, and affirm together with the Lord, that you walk no longer just as the Gentiles also walk, in the futility of their mind, being darkened in their understanding and excluded from the life of God because of the ignorance that is in them, because of the hardness of their heart. And they, having become callous, have given themselves over to sensuality for the practice of every kind of impurity. with greediness. But you did not learn Christ in this way. If indeed you have heard him and have been taught in him, just as truth is in Jesus, that in reference to your former manner of life, you lay aside the old self, which is being corrupted in accordance with the lusts of deceit, and that you be renewed in the spirit of your mind, and put on the new self, which in the likeness of God has been created in righteousness and holiness of the truth. So we're going to focus on three things here, and I've underlined them here in the slide that's on the screen. We're going to talk about laying aside the old self. We're going to talk about renewing the spirit of our minds, and we're going to talk about putting on the new self. So first, to recap the verses that Paul writes before getting to these verses from 17 to verse 21. Paul introduces this section by speaking to these people in Ephesus who are receiving this letter and telling them not to walk any longer as the Gentiles walk. And that's a little bit ironic because the people that he's talking to are Gentiles. So he's basically telling them to quit being yourselves, quit being like the other people that are around you in Ephesus. Because those people, the Gentiles, they live and operate in the futility of their minds. They've been darkened in their understanding and excluded from the life of God because of the ignorance that is in them, because of the hardness of their hearts. So we have to ask ourselves, well, how did these people become so hard of heart? How did they become futile in their minds in the way that they were living their lives? And I think it's helpful for us to just put this into very plain and straightforward English. Paul is essentially saying that these people, they've abandoned their moral compass. They've lost their direction on what's right and what's wrong. They've been corrupted. Their thinking is futile. It's off course. It's been off track. And because of that, their understanding of how to operate in this world, how to make decisions, has been completely darkened. Paul uses this image of darkness and light, both in chapter 4 and chapter 5 in Ephesians. And he talks about the light of Christ in chapter 5. I would encourage us to spend time there later. But he says that they've been excluded from the life of God because of the ignorance that is within them, because of the hardness of their hearts. And because of all of this, they've become callous. And I think we all understand what it means to become callous. And we talk about having calluses maybe on our feet or on our hands. It's that part of our body that we use a lot, and it becomes tough and hardened, or at least tougher or more hardened than other parts of our skin. So he's using this comparison to talk about their own hearts and their minds. And in the back half of verse 19, he says, they've given themselves over to sensuality for the practice of every kind of impurity with greediness. But then Paul says, you did not learn Christ in this way. This goes against everything that you've been taught with respect to what Christ, what King Jesus is calling you to live like. So in verse 21, Paul says, or in verse 20, he says, you did not learn Christ in this way, but indeed you have heard him and have been taught in him, just as truth is in Jesus, that in reference to your former manner of life, you lay aside the old self. Laying aside the old self. I think maybe our initial reaction to this as Christians is to kind of dismiss this, because we think about, well, yes, of course, we're not supposed to steal and to murder and to covet and to do these things that we see, of course, laid out in the Ten Commandments, and to see the things that Jesus so actively teaches and preaches against in his ministry. But we often consider ourselves to not really be in that old self because, well, those sins are at a higher level, or those sins are things that we don't participate in. But I think Paul is digging into something a little bit deeper here than just simply, well, don't murder, don't steal. Because what Paul seems to be saying here is that if your thinking and your mindset is not focused in the right place, that eventually even the good things that you desire to do those same things can become crippling and can become stumbling. They can become lustful deceits. There are many things in this life we know that God has intended them for good. We turn them for the worse, don't we? Things like work. To work is to do something good. God intends for us to work. He intends for us to serve. Even our theme is about being equipped to serve, being equipped to do good works. But even works that can be intended for good can be turned for bad purposes. Even a job that God has rewarded us with can become later an idol that we devote too much time and energy towards. Relationships are the same way. God has designed us for relationships. But even relationships, we can turn for the worse. We can turn them into a quid pro quo. Well, I am going to just help this person so that they help me. I'm just going to be friends with this person so that I can reap the benefits of what they offer in a relationship. I want this person to be in a relationship with this person because I simply better myself from it. There are good things, many good things in life that start out as positive, but we turn them into bad things because we don't have the right mindset. Paul is not calling us to try and hide or to sweep the bad things that we do under the rug, to try and shove them in the closet and close the door before they spill back out. Paul is calling us here to recognize and to just acknowledge who we are. We're sinners, and there's nothing wrong with saying that. We are sinners. We do not make the right decision 100% of the time. And that's what Paul wants us to recognize here. Put off the old self. Acknowledge that you cannot do this on your own, and put that self behind you. This same verbiage of the old self, or other versions here may read the old man, or some versions in the room may even say something about humanity. We find this same type of language in Romans, which also written by Paul. Makes sense that he would make connections here. In Romans 6, verse 6, we're familiar with the old self was crucified with Christ in order that our body of sin might be done away with. We see a direct connection here between what happens when we put away the old self, we put away sin. That's what Paul and essentially Christ is calling us to do here. The second piece of our focus here. So lay aside the old self, which is being corrupted in accordance with the lusts of deceit, that you be renewed in the spirit of your mind. Now, I'm going to pause us here, and we're going to come back to this in a moment, because I started off talking about a bridge between the old and the new. My hypothesis and my theory to you this morning is that I think Paul is saying that renewing the spirit of our minds is this bridge. So let's pause on that, and let's keep going to this new self. We're going to talk about the new self, and then we'll come back to the renewing of our minds. So verse 24, Paul then encourages us to put on the new self. So what is this new self? And I think the most simple way to describe what the new self is it's simply becoming a reflection of the image of God. But the problem with trying to become the image of God is that we know that the old self is right there hanging on to us, and that we cannot become the image of God by ourselves. In fact, if we remember back to the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve were made in the image of who? They were made in the image of God. We are all in this room. We were made in the image of God. However, we have listened to the old self to the extent that we are no longer that same perfect creation, that same image of God that He intended for us to be. So when we talk about putting on the new self, the second way I'd like to define the new self is that it's a version of ourselves that isn't possible without Jesus. So when Paul says, put on your new self, and he's not talking about being schizophrenic, your old self, your new self. If you have any Lord of the Rings fans in here, we're not talking about being Gollum, where one moment you're Smeagol, one moment you're talking to yourself over here, and the next moment you're talking to a different self over here. We're putting away the old self. We're putting on this new self that is a version of us that we cannot become without Jesus. It's unattainable without Jesus. The women this morning, I think maybe you started your study off at the beginning of chapter 4. If I understood correctly, you were looking at at least the first verse, if not the first several verses. And if we go back to the beginning of chapter 4, we get a little bit of a picture of what that new self looks like. Chapter 4, verse 1, therefore I, the prisoner of the Lord, remember Paul is writing Ephesians from where? From prison. He's writing to these Ephesians from prison in Rome. And he says in verse 1 that I, the prisoner of the Lord, implore you to walk in a manner worthy of the calling with which you have been called, with all humility and gentleness, with patience, showing tolerance for one another in love, being diligent to preserve the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. So if we want to get really practical, there's really two places here in chapter 4 where Paul makes this new self very practical. The first one is here at the beginning of the chapter. Humility, embracing gentleness, patience, tolerance. Those are not things that come to my mind when I think of what is my default setting in life. Daniel's default is not humility, gentleness, patience, and tolerance with other people. Those are things that are a part of the new self. Those are things that come from Jesus. And maybe if I at times do reflect those things in my own life, it's only because Jesus is helping me to demonstrate those things. They're part of the new self. The other ways that Paul makes this new self really practical is if you keep reading in chapter 4, and we don't have the time to read all of the remainder of chapter 4, but after he talks about the new self in verse 24, he continues from 25 down to the end of the chapter by describing in the most practical sense what it looks like to be this new self. He talks about truth-telling, not being angry. Well, he says, when you are angry, don't sin. So he basically admits we're going to be angry, and it's about controlling that anger. So we're truth-tellers, we're self-controlled, we don't steal, we watch the words that come out of our mouths, we don't grieve the Spirit, we don't become bitter. These are all ways that Paul makes it very clear what it looks like to live in this new self. So how do we get from old to new? We have a picture of what the old self looks like, and we have a picture of the new self and what that looks like. But how do we bridge this gap from old to new? Well, Paul says that it's by renewing the spirit of our minds. And remember all these examples we talked about at the beginning. The mind has power over behavior. Our behaviors are directly tied to the things that are in our minds. Renewing our minds is the key to dismissing the old self and to becoming the new self. Renewing our mindset is more than just behavior. Only changing your behavior isn't what God is asking for. God doesn't want mindless robots, I guess said otherwise. And that, I think, is hard for us to hear as Christians. I want the lesson this morning to be both encouraging but also challenging. And if I think there's one thing that lifelong Christians or long-tenured Christians can take away from this lesson today is for us to look at ourselves and determine whether we do the things we do simply to be robotic and to please God just by doing those things, or if we're doing them because we're renewing our minds and the outpouring of this new mindset is our behavior. Once our mentality changes, our behaviors will follow. In the mindset of Christ, it doesn't matter where we've been, how talented we are or are not, or how we got to where we are today. Christ is not concerned with anything in our past. He's concerned with the renewing of our mind that then points us in a new direction going forward. Jesus makes this same point in the parable of the vineyard workers. If you remember, there are workers who start in the morning, some who start at midday, and then if we understand the passage correctly, there were some workers who started late in the afternoon. And what happened once it came pay time at the end of the day. Do you remember how this parable ends when Christ says that all of these different workers did what? They were paid the same. And of course, our initial reaction is like, what? You're telling me that the guy that clocked in at 4 p.m. got paid the same as the guy who punched the clock at 8 a.m. and worked all day long? And Jesus says, yes. He says, in my kingdom, that's how things operate. In my kingdom, once your mind is renewed, once you have committed yourself to my kingdom and have changed the way that you live your life, it doesn't matter what happened before. And that's hard for us to hear as long tenured Christians. But that's the way Jesus' kingdom works. So we kind of have one of two choices, and really we only have one choice, which is let's get on board with Jesus here. Renewing our mindset is the key to going from old self to new self. Once again, Paul makes a similar connection in Romans chapter 12, and I'm sure many of you have maybe already thought about this while you're sitting there listening. Romans chapter 12. Can somebody turn to Romans chapter 12 and maybe read verse 2 for us, please? Romans chapter 12, verse 2. Perfect, that's great.
I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that ye present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service. Which is your reasonable service. And be not conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is good and acceptable and perfect will of God.
Thank you, brother. I hope you caught the phrase there. It's the same phrase that we're talking about in Ephesians chapter 4. The renewing of your mind. Paul says, do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And then he helps us make the connection here to what happens when your mind is renewed. He says, then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. If our minds are not renewed, we cannot make accurate judgments about what God's will is for us in our life, and for what the decisions are that God would have us to make and that Christ would have us to make in our lives. As Christians, we profess to be followers of Jesus Christ. We profess that we walk around every day living our lives in the same manner that Jesus would if he were here today. That's our goal every day when we wake up, to make it very plain and simple, right? Our goal is not to go to work or to go to school or to go to have a fun day or anything like that. No matter what we're doing, our goal is to wake up and to be Christ-like in whatever it is that we're doing. And Paul says in Romans chapter 12 that if your mind has not been renewed, then that's going to be really difficult for you. Because if your mind hasn't been renewed, you can't distinguish the difference between the old self and the new self. There may be moments of brilliance where you dabble a little bit in the new self, where you make some good decisions, you have a positive impact on your community. But he says that over time, if you don't have your mind renewed, that the lusts of deceit will ultimately corrupt your mindset and will corrupt your decision making. So you say to yourself, and I say to myself on a daily basis, well, I can do this. I don't need to renew my mindset today. I can get this done. And the day starts out okay, and I make a couple of good decisions, but then before long, the bad ones start to creep in. The old self starts to appear. And I don't mean to shrink it down to a small sample of one day. Many people live their lives like this over long periods of time. And it starts out, they may not be Christians, but they do many good things in life. But over time, Paul says, if you do not renew your mindset to be that of Jesus Christ, that ultimately you will be corrupted. And the good things of this world, the good things of your life will become deceitful lusts. Even the things that start out positive, family, love, relationship, those things can ultimately be corrupted by our own personal selfish desires and lusts. That's why Paul says it's so critical for for us to have our minds renewed. You can't just jump from the old to the new and skip the renewing of your mind, because it won't stick. It may be there for a short amount of time, but it won't stick. It's ultimately corrupted. So, to try and pull all this together, the mind, it's very powerful. Paul, in other words, kind of talks about the mind as this secret weapon. And oftentimes, we love to operate in an environment where we're just told to, well, if you do these 3 things, then you're good to go. If you complete your tasks at work and you can go home. You do these steps on your homework assignment and you'll finish it and you'll be done. But that's not how this works. The renewing of our minds is a continual thing. Becoming the new self is not a process that, as hard as this also might be to hear, we talk about the steps of salvation. Well, okay, maybe there are some helpful things as a part of salvation that we can outline to help instruct people on how they can become Christians. But that is not the end of what it means to become the new self. Simply being saved is not the end of that process. The renewing of our minds is ongoing. It's continual. It goes beyond the waters of baptism. It goes beyond our confession to follow Christ. It's a part of this faithful obedience that continues on and on and on throughout our lives, where we become less and less of the old and more of the new. The key to that bridge is renewing the spirit of our minds. So, why does this matter? Why are these things important? What can we walk away from after thinking about this small but powerful passage in Ephesians chapter 4? Number 1, if your mind hasn't been renewed or is not in the process of continually being renewed, it's only a matter of time before your desire to do the right thing diminishes. And we can think about that with Paul's analogy of darkness and light. What starts out as light, what may have started out as a good thing for the Ephesians or for the Gentiles that Paul calls out earlier in the chapter, it ultimately was darkened. Their hearts were ultimately hardened. If our minds aren't renewed, it's only a matter of time before our desires to do the right thing diminish. An unrenewed mind cannot navigate the complexity of moral decision-making. Only the mind of Christ can navigate these complex decisions that we have to make on a daily basis about what's right and what's wrong. And if Christ is not a part of our mentality, if we haven't renewed our minds to be that of Christ, then we just cannot do and navigate those decisions on our own. The second thing I want to close with ties back to our theme for the year. We started out by talking about the theme. Let's close on the theme. Being equipped to serve. If your mind hasn't been renewed to be like that of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, then ultimately the service, the works that we are trying to do as followers of Christ that Paul talks about in verse 12, being equipped to serve, those works, those acts of service to others are undercut. And I think we all know I think you'll understand what I mean when I use the word hypocrisy. The things that we do, not just say, the things that even we do that are acts of service and kindness, those things can later be undercut and canceled out if the old self takes over our new self. If someone sees you do something positive in the name of Jesus Christ, and then later you're not operating like that, you're operating in the old way of the old self, that act of service, being that you spent the time to equip yourself, you spent the time to become prepared to do it, you did it, you even carried out that wonderful act, it's later undercut by our own hypocrisy of the old self. So renewing our mind is key, because it not just enables us to become the new self, but it also helps us to faithfully continue to represent what it means to follow Jesus. So, we've talked about a lot of things this morning. I appreciate and thank you for your attention. I don't want to close without offering a challenge to Christians in the room and on the Zoom, and an invitation to those who have not accepted Jesus Christ as your King and your Lord and your Savior. And that's simply to say that no matter who you are in this room, your mind should be renewed. And it needs to continue being renewed. And this applies to me as well. There is no one in this room today, and it's nice when you can teach a message like that, because no one feels like, oh, well, he's not speaking to me. If you're in the room and you're hearing me, I'm speaking to you this morning. And I'm hoping that it's Jesus who is speaking through me today, to say that your mind needs to be renewed every single day. If you're a Christian, this is a call to an encouragement to keep going, to keep renewing your mind, and to say that, you know what, I'm not there yet, and I accept that, I acknowledge it. There are ways in which the old self continues to show up in Daniel's life, but today I'm going to have my mind renewed. I'm going to keep suppressing the old and allowing the new to take hold. And if you're not a Christian, if you have never assessed your life and said, I want to follow Jesus, then you have that opportunity today. And the mental renewal process to get your mind in that of the Spirit of Christ, you have the opportunity to do that today. It is available to you, and there are many people in this room that will help get you connected to Jesus Christ. That's what we want to do. So thank you for your attention this morning. I'm going to turn it back over to Brother Alfred to lead us in a song of encouragement.